When I think about these terms, and I'm thinking of the word defensive AI, well, offensive AI I associate with being proactive. Then automatically I would assume defensive AI to be reactive. But I don't think that's a fair comparison or it's worth the comparison. So the question I have for you is, how do you differentiate between the two, and what is more applicable for certain organizations compared to others?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think about it in one term, which is blast radius. The goal of defense, if you're a cyber defender, your goal is to minimize the blast radius of an initial compromise. The attacker's going to get in. One way or the other, they're going to find a way in. Once they're in, how do you minimize the damage they can cause? At the end of the day, cyber defense is about blast radius management. That's why you start to segment your network, reduce privileges of your credentials, and so on. The goal of offensive AI is to discover the blast radius. If I gained access to the DMC, what could I do? It's about identifying the damage that is possible. And what you want to create is this integrated learning loop between attack and defend. And you're using the attack and defend to learn about the blast radiuses that you have in place now and where you need to invest to reduce that radius to minimize damage and risk to the company. That's why I see this, is this integrated learning loop between attack and defend.
Welcome to the Cybersecurity Readiness Podcast Series with Dr. Dave Chatterjee. Dr. Chatterjee is the author of the book Cybersecurity Readiness, a holistic and high-performance approach, a Sage publication. He has been studying cybersecurity for over a decade, authored and edited scholarly papers, delivered talks, conducted webinars and workshops, consulted with companies, and served on a cybersecurity SWAT team with Chief Information Security Officers. His work on proactive cybersecurity has been featured on USA Today. Dr. Chatterjee has been a tenured professor at the Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia. As a Duke University visiting scholar, Dr. Chatterjee teaches in the cybersecurity programs at the Pratt School of Engineering.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cybersecurity Readiness Podcast Series. I'm your host, Dave Chatterjee. Imagine this. It's 2:17 a.m. in the morning. An AI-enabled adversary is already inside your network, autonomously mapping privileges, probing defenses, and adapting in real time. Your dashboards are green. Your controls appear intact, but the attacker's AI is learning faster than your defenses are responding. This is the emerging AI versus AI reality of cyber risk. In today's episode, we explore why a purely defensive posture is no longer sufficient and how offensive AI is helping forward-leaning organizations continuously validate, detect, and outmaneuver modern threats. To explore this phenomenon, I'm delighted to welcome Snehal Antani, former Chief Technology Officer of Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, and he's now the CEO and co-founder of Horizon3.ai. As a member of the commander's executive team, Snehal led data analytics, cloud edge computing, and cybersecurity initiatives. Prior to serving within U.S. Special Operations, Snehal was CTO and SPP at Splunk, held multiple CIO roles at GE Capital, and started his career as a software engineer at IBM. So as you can tell, I have a very distinguished guest today, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to him. Snehal, welcome to the show.
Amazing. Thank you for having me here, Dave.
So Snehal, why don't you share a few highlights from your extremely impressive career?
Well, what I'll say is that every job I held at the time had a purpose, particular skill I was trying to go off and learn. So to join IBM Poughkeepsie, which in the early 2000s was not Silicon Valley, but you learned something very different. You learned about the mainframe, you learned about enterprise computing, and this quote, the difference between those that say mainframe and those that say cloud is the year they were born. And so you got to learn a lot about the fundamentals of computing and enterprise software, to becoming a customer of enterprise software at GE Capital, and then learning about how to leverage technology to transform the business. My time at Splunk, I got to understand how to scale organizations and go-to-market functions and participate in hypergrowth. And then finally at JSOC, the ability to sit alongside some of the greatest leaders the world will never know about and keep my mouth shut, listen, learn, and view it almost like a PhD program in leadership in those 4 years there. Really set the conditions for me to execute as a founder, CEO of a hypergrowth company that I'm at today.
Fascinating. As you mentioned about your experience with JSOC, many years ago, I was doing a fellowship at the Boeing company, and I had the opportunity of working in their defense part of their business. And I would get meetings or get to meet with some of the 4-star generals who were leading some of the operational units there and have one-on-one discussions on technology, alignment. At that point in time, they were going through a merger between Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. I'm talking about 1998, 2000. But similar to you, I would listen in rapt attention as they would share their experiences from their time in the field, plus now their corporate experience. And there was so much to learn. So
yeah, amazing.
That's phenomenal. So to get the ball rolling here, from your vantage point, what has fundamentally changed in the cyber threat landscape in recent years?
I would say you got to separate out the fear mongering that you'll see on X or Twitter from reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll ground this in kind of reality and direct experiences. So we pioneered at Horizon3 this concept of AI hackers. Like, we invented this space, and we were the first to build an AI hacker that could operate against production systems. And our AI hacker was able to do some pretty remarkable things over the past 12 months. For one, it was able to successfully find and gain access to and steal sensitive design files for Nimitz-class aircraft carriers and Virginia-class submarines from a third-party supplier in less than 5 minutes. In fact, I was on stage at Black Hat with the NSA keynoting and talking about what this looked like. We had a 9-year-old kid with no cyber experience whatsoever use the product and point, click, shoot, and hack a bank in less than in about 4 minutes and 12 seconds. But the real eye-opener for me was watching this AI hacker go after a production defense tech company and get full domain compromised in 77 seconds. If your SOC can't stop me in 76 seconds, it's game over. Because at second 77, with domain admin privileges, I'm locking you out of the building, I'm locking you out of your machines, I'm pilfering all of your sensitive data, I'm changing all of your network configs, I'm burrowing deeply into the organization. And so the question is, can your SOC stop us in 76 seconds? And the answer is likely not. Because in 76 seconds, you could have glanced down at your phone, you could have gotten up to go to the restroom or grab a coffee. That's not a lot of time. And in that, and even if you did see the alert, do you have the experience and the processes and the authorities to characterize the risk of the alert, understand the actions to be taken, and actually take those actions to stifle or reduce the blast radius of the attack? And so what we see as the future of cyber warfare is AI fighting AI with humans by exception. And we have this fundamental challenge where the attackers are getting faster and more effective, far quicker than the defenders are able to become faster. And so we have this asymmetric warfare where the attacker's in our OODA loop, if you will, back to Boeing and the Air Force. And what do we do about it? I think that is the question we've got to answer without being succumbed to the hype that exists on vendor marketing and so on that you see today.
Well, thanks for that very enlightening and scary example. That is the reality that AI is compressing attacker dwell time. The attack surfaces has exploited. And when you share that example of how easily the 9-year-old was able to use that tool to hack into pretty sophisticated systems, I'm left wondering what happens to small and medium-sized businesses.
Yeah, so a great way to think about it, I grew up playing a lot of video games. And you had certain video games, think of the old first-person shooter games, where you had limited ammunition. And so you were very careful in the targets you selected and the shots that you took, right? But if you put in the cheat code, the up, up, down, down, left, right, BA, start, if you played Contra, Suddenly you had unlimited ammunition and you were just on full auto all the time. You didn't care, right? The same thing happens in offensive cyber operations. Your limited resources are the seasoned on-net operators. Whether you are a nation state or a criminal organization, you don't have a lot of highly skilled hackers. You're severely constrained. So you're much more selective of the targets you're going after, the really big banks or the really big crypto agencies or whatever else. But when you have effectively unlimited or infinite offensive cyber capacity using AI, you've put in the cheat code. You no longer have to be selective of your target. And suddenly, that 50-person design company for the Navy that has the Nimitz class design files, they're absolutely viable to be attacked. And so that's what AI unlocks. It's infinite cyber capacity. And as a result, the adversary no longer has to be selective of your target. And therefore, the long tail of critical suppliers in particular, I think, are the most at risk because they're the ones that don't have the skills or the capability to defend themselves. I'll pause there and talk about what I think that means from a cyber market standpoint. But does that make sense the way I talk about it?
Yes, that's exactly. In fact, if I could summarize really quickly in a sentence, essentially what you're saying, everybody is now fair game given the ease with which the AI ammunition is available in plenty, in abundance.
Exactly right. And then the interesting thing is, if you take the Midwest of America, where you take this corridor between Houston and Atlanta, Milwaukee and Pittsburgh, in that corridor, you have a few things. You've got the heart and soul of oil and gas, of agriculture, of a variety of forms of energy, wind and so on. You've got the bulk of our core manufacturing, a lot of really important jobs, whether it's automotive or so on. You also have not a whole lot of skilled cybersecurity talent, like the density of talent isn't there. And so how does that corridor, where a cyber attack could shut down against a small supplier to Ford or to whomever, could shut down entire production manufacturing lines, what do we do? And this is actually where I think the role of MSSPs and managed detection response and kind of that SOC as a service provider becomes really important. So I actually, not only do I see the rise of infinite cyber bullets through the role of AI, I also see the rise correspondingly with the role of the MSSP, because they're the ones that have the talent and technical density necessary to supply the long tail. So I think we're going to see some really interesting market shifts in the next couple of years as you start to see more of these cyber attacks become mainstream.
Okay, that's good to hear. So essentially what you're saying is for small to medium-sized organizations with limited resources, their best bet is to reach out to the MSSPs and hire an appropriate outfit.
I think it's easier and faster and more effective to do that if you're in the long tail than to try to build up and skill up your own AI SOC. It's just maybe in half a decade or a decade from now, you've got a turnkey, click the easy button, you're now suddenly secure through some magical AI. However, I just don't see that happening in a time scale sufficient to defend against the speed at which attackers are moving.
Okay, at least you're being very clear. So there's no question of trying to develop skill sets in-house, get up to speed on AI defensive technologies. Best is to do a good job finding the right MSSP.
If you're in the long tail, if you are the NASDAQ or a big bank in New York City or Facebook or somebody else that has the density to do so, you have a different problem. The different problem you have if you're really large is your environment's so large, you probably don't have enough skills to assess and secure and defend that massive network. It's like brushing one tooth once a year, right? That's all you've got the capacity to go do. And so how do you use AI as a force multiplier so you can brush all of your teeth at least once a month, if not, hopefully twice a day, right? And so you want to be able to assess yourself and look at yourself through the eyes of the attacker as often as possible. And here, what I see happening is the role of offensive AI as a force multiplier to help assess and identify where you're exploitable at scale. And I think where you're going to see a lot of pressure is on consultants that just don't have the capacity to test at scale. And the role of the human in that world becomes one focused on highly specialized bespoke software, custom application testing as an example, is a uniquely human problem to go solve. The long tail of OT systems, the PLCs and other things where it's difficult to build attack algorithms because you don't have access to those kinds of cyber ranges. I think humans become really focused on these long tail bespoke technologies to exploit, but the role of offensive AI in the really large banks, in the really large infra, insurance, and pharma, and so on, becomes that of force multiplier to your team to pen test and assess yourself at scale.
Okay. Now, since you mentioned the word offensive AI, automatically one is prone to think that if there is an offensive AI, there is also a defensive AI. But when I think about these terms, and I'm thinking of the word defensive AI, well, offensive AI I associate with being proactive. Then automatically I would assume defensive AI to be reactive. But I don't think that's a fair comparison, or it's worth the comparison. So the question I have for you is, how do you differentiate between the two, and what is more applicable for certain organizations compared to others?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think about it in one term, which is blast radius. The goal of defense, if you're a cyber defender, your goal is to minimize the blast radius of an initial compromise. The attacker's going to get in. One way or the other, they're going to find a way in. Once they're in, how do you minimize the damage they can cause? At the end of the day, cyber defense is about blast radius management. That's why you start to segment your network, reduce privileges of your credentials, and so on, protect your data. The goal of offensive AI is to discover the blast radius. If I gained access to the DMC, what could I do? It's about identifying the damage that is possible. And what you want to create is this integrated learning loop between attack and defend. And you're using the attack and defend to learn about the blast radiuses that you have in place now and where you need to invest to reduce that radius to minimize damage and risk to the company. That's why I see this is this integrated learning loop between attack and defend.
So essentially what you're saying is it's not either or. You need both.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is the way that one can learn from the other. So a big challenge today is there is no training data set for production systems. And it's actually similar to what Tesla went through for full self-driving 10 years ago. There was no public corpus of training data to train FSD algorithms. So what did Tesla do? They put cameras on every car. They started collecting video clips, and their AI said, in this situation, I would have slammed on the brakes and swerved, but the driver turned left. Why did the driver do this? And I said I would do something else. And you can start to understand and train up algorithms to become better at driving. You're basically looking at the environment and understanding what to do. There is no equivalent public configurations data set for people to train defensive AI off of, or offensive AI for that matter. And this is something we saw early. So at Horizon 3, we're not a pen testing company. That was the first use case. For me, pen testing is a sensor that's collecting the production training data necessary to build defensive AI agents. And the reason why this is super interesting is when you attack an environment, you're stimulating it. You are executing a command to compromise a host, and then you're going to dump LSAS or LSA or SAM or other sensitive processes. You're stimulating the environment, and you're going to be in a position to see, well, how did the network, how did the SIM, how did the EDR respond? Oh, it blocked me. Great. Or it didn't. What happened? And so if you understand those pairs, in production, you're collecting the training data necessary to build defensive AI. And that's actually the biggest challenge we have today is all these defensive AI agent companies do not have the high resolution production network data necessary to actually build impactful agents, which is why you see a big discrepancy between how these defensive AI agents work in the labs versus how they actually work in a real environment.
Okay. So, once again, wearing the listener's hat, depending on whether I'm in a mid-sized organization or a larger organization, if I'm trying to imagine a checklist of things that I need to be considering to assess where the organization is from a defensive or an offensive AI security maturity standpoint, what are those 3 or 4 things I need to evaluate?
So the first thing, I was a CIO.
Mm-hmm.
So answering that question with my CIO hat on, when I first took any CIO job,
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea where the bodies were buried. I had no idea where we were secure, what risks we had accepted, what risks we blindly accepted because we didn't know, or how effective our tools were. So my first act was discover where the bodies are buried, run a comprehensive pen test, and as wide a scope as possible, and do it with no notice. I want to understand where am I exploitable. I want to understand how effective the EDR was at detecting and responding, how effective the SOC was, and what did the SOC do? Because if they don't know how to respond to a breach, they're not going to learn so in the middle of a breach. You need to build that muscle memory ahead of time. You have to train like you fight. So that is the first step. With that, I'm going to go off and drive a set of key initiatives. The first initiative is reducing my exploitable attack surface. Just because I have a vulnerability doesn't mean it's exploitable. I could have had compensating controls in place. So I actually throw away and ignore my vulnerability lists, the vuln scanner lists, because that's not proven to be exploitable. Where am I actually exploitable? What threat actors are known to use those tactics, and what are the consequences of my organizations? That becomes the first stream of effort. The second stream of effort is, what did my SOC tools see? Did they log us? Did they alert on the test? Did they actually stop the pen test? If not, why not? And actually hold daily war rooms with all of the key SOC tool stakeholders to ask those questions and build out the backlog of improving our detections, improving our logging, so on and so forth. And then the final initiative is that muscle memory. There's a lot of overlap between companies that took disaster recovery seriously that are also, as a result, quite good at responding to cyber breaches. Companies that never tested their backups, that never tested failover, that never tested HADR, likely have never actually practiced a real cyber incident either. And so the third line of effort is, how do I build the muscle memory for responding to an incident, whether it's an outage or a breach? Because in the first 20 minutes, you don't know if a server crashed because of an IT admin config change or a hack. And so you want to make sure you've built that muscle memory for incident response. So if I kind of go back, stimulate the environment with a comprehensive pen test, focus on what's exploitable, maximize the effectiveness of your SOC tools, and build the muscle memory for response. Those are, to me, the first few moves.
Fantastic. Now, like you said earlier, if I'm a smaller organization, limited resource capacity, and I have to rely on an MSSP to do all the testing and resiliency management, for lack of a better word, then these four things that you talked about, will these four things be handled by the MSSP, and my organization will have a team working with them closely? Is that how it works out?
Yeah. So in fact, it's the same four moves, but when you do a no-notice pen test against the MSSP, what you're really doing is auditing their response time, because they have SLAs and they are contractually responsible to deliver on those SLAs. And so when you do the no-notice pen test, and if they're supposed to detect and respond and stifle in 5 minutes, and it takes them 5 hours, you're going to have a very different conversation. So for me, it's auditing the effectiveness or the response time of your MSSP. That's one of the outcomes. The next is, most mid-sized companies and small companies, they're still the ones responsible for actually fixing stuff, unless they've gone full stack outsource. And so they've got to have a hard conversation of, how are they going to marshal the resources to actually do remediation? In those smaller companies, remediation is the bottleneck. And so it becomes very important to find the right remediation partner. And then finally, for incident response, usually that's also part of the MSSP. You're going to be auditing their ability to respond. But what I've seen over and over again is the IT service provider and the security service provider are two different companies. And if those are two different shops, they're going to collide and they're not going to be coordinated. So this gives you a chance to really understand the integration problems between your IT service provider and your security service provider.
Okay, excellent. So now let's consider the human factor. The human factor, the security culture. I come at cybersecurity from the more of the humanistic side. I developed a framework called the Commitment, Preparedness, Discipline Framework, which is a holistic framework, which focuses on helping organizations, using your words, build that muscle memory so that they can be prepared for any kind of attack and quickly recover and restore. And under the three pillars of my framework, commitment, preparedness, and discipline, there are several success factors. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of that today, but I'll try to connect some of the dots here. One of the things that I've seen to be significant from a commitment standpoint is how keyed in, how locked in, how attentive is the senior management to security issues. Is it a security-first organization, or is it a compliance-focused organization? That's kind of one of the ways I have seen how the security posture varies from organization to organization. And then you talked extensively on the preparedness aspect. I think you gave some great pointers. And then discipline is about institutionalizing certain processes, whether it's regular, pen testing, whether it's doing the real-time audits, whether it's doing training and not just tabletop, but more extensive. So having that discipline in place, you used the example of brushing your teeth, if I remember correctly. So I use the same example that, are you brushing your teeth on a regular basis multiple times? And in the context of security, are you checking to make sure the controls that you have in place, do they really work? So I come at it the same thing, but I'm framing it a little different. But I want to come back to you and ask you, given that you've had a military background experience, where obviously, if you make mistakes, the consequences can be fatal or catastrophic. And so the training should be so extensive that you don't make big mistakes. How do you see that translate into the private sector?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things that I learned I always viewed myself as a tourist in JSOC, meaning I didn't come from a military background. I didn't serve in uniform. I had the privilege of leaving industry to work as a civilian, first chief technology officer within a very amazing and elite military organization. And there are two things I learned. One is a bunch of leadership lessons, but the other one was this. And I remember when I first joined this, one of my colleagues said, the thing at JSOC is, it's not like Mission Impossible, the movies, where they're doing these one-off stream down from the ceiling and do some crazy aerobatic first time ever. Because what they really become adept at is mastering the fundamentals. They are the experts at shoot, move, and communicate. They practice the fundamentals all day, every day, so that it's second nature and it's muscle memory. And what makes them incredibly elite is they execute the fundamentals flawlessly. And so for me, that's what translates well into industry, and especially into cybersecurity. And this goes back to training like you fight. You have to master the fundamentals and execute the fundamentals flawlessly in order to be a high-performing organization. And that becomes a really key part of where I think the operational cadence translate well from the military side of the house to the industry side of the house.
Very well said. In fact, I'm going to pick on two things to further emphasize or re-emphasize. One is mastering the fundamentals. I can't think of it being said any more significantly, or it couldn't have been better articulated than you just did. As technologies happen, new things come, we keep talking about doing this, doing that. Yesterday, I was at a conference and I was emphasizing the importance of, let's not forget about doing the basics and doing them well. There's this huge rush to quickly check the box, the compliance list, so we can get the next certificate, so we can get approved for a certain contract, and so on and so forth. I've experienced that firsthand when organizations have reached out to me to say, hey, can you get us compliance ready so we can increase our market share? And I could tell from the conversation that they just wanted to check the box and not really be focused on substantively addressing the controls, whether it's hiring a CISO and making sure the organization is set up structurally and from an incentive standpoint to make the CISO function successful, or whether the training program really does the job, as opposed to everybody has gone through it, they have all signed off that they have had the training, but there's no way of assessing how effective the training was. So I'm just using two examples to illustrate that there are a lot of success factors out there. It's not new news, but the discipline and the commitment of doing them well, that significantly varies from organization to organization. That's been my experience, when I talk to different prospective clients and regular clients. What's been yours?
Yeah, I would say compliance sets the floor. And depending on the industry, it's your burden to raise the ceiling. As an example, in healthcare and in hospitals, I had the fortunate experience of spending almost 80 days in the ICU, 40 for caring for two different elderly, my mother-in-law and my father. And 40 days in the ICU, you get a lot of time to talk to people as they're caring for your loved ones. And I remember talking to the nurses and the doctors come in, you've got some time. And oh, you're in cybersecurity? Yes, I am. Well, let me tell you about this time we got ransomware. And this nurse was telling me this story about how they got ransomware and they had never practiced paper processes as a hospital. And when all of their digital systems went down, nobody knew what to do because they'd become so reliant on digital workflows. And so it was a scramble, and it cost lives, right, to some degree. And as you double click, it turns out there's a single process in the hospital that is completely digital with no backup plan, which is the blood bank. So when a blood bank, which is responsible for delivering blood products to the ICU room for a transfusion or for a multitude of reasons, the ICU and the NICU, when the blood bank goes down digitally, they don't have a paper process equivalent in most hospitals. And the risk of giving the wrong blood to the wrong patient or losing inventory is very high. And so everything just kind of shuts down. And now you're in a very dangerous situation. And so that hospital, I'm sure, was compliant to everything, but that doesn't mean they are responsibly operating the business. And so raising the bar, if you're in hospitals and healthcare, or you're in national security, your other key verticals where lives are on the line, your job is to raise the bar. And I think that's one of the really important aspects of business leadership that's important, which is the difference between setting the ceiling and raising the bar.
Well, thanks for using that example of healthcare and ICU. In June of last year, I was in the ICU undergoing an open heart surgery. And of course, I had a great experience with the care providers. I'm reasonably familiar with the hospital processes, but not an expert. But this is news to me that they have processes that are totally digital. And if those processes are attacked or compromised, then the operations totally shut down. But I totally agree with you that it is incumbent on every organization to recognize or prioritize what their critical workflows are and run different types of disaster scenarios and see what the consequences are and how quickly they can recover from those consequences. We have fire drills in our organizations in the US. It's fairly common practice. But I don't see security drills. I don't see organizations running ransomware attacks. They have tabletop exercises. That's there, but that's not good enough. Doing it more extensively and seeing how the organization responds, reacts, that's a game changer. And I'm glad that we're talking about it. And you mentioned about the criticality of certain industries compared to others. So it will be our recommendation, I hope you'll agree, that organizations, especially in the critical sector, consider doing more hands-on security drills to identify their weaknesses. And it should be a continuous process to constantly update their abilities. And like you said, to raise the bar, raise the ceiling. That's so critical.
And also, by the way, back to the principle or process of training like you fight, you have to build that muscle memory for incident response. I remember, back to JSOC, one of my colleagues said, the reason why the special operations unit train with live ammunition, which is a pretty big risk. Why would you take on that risk? The reason why they train with live ammunition is because with rubber bullets or fake bullets, everyone acts like a Medal of Honor recipient. Only under live ammunition are you going to actually see how you respond in chaos and in threat and in risk. And he goes, I want to know how my teams are going to behave and operate in live fire exercises so I know what I'm going to get when I'm actually in a real one. And we've already worked through the anxieties, the fears, the risks, the processes, the communications challenges ahead of time, because I don't want to learn about how they're going to react when I'm in the fight. I want to know that we've built the muscle memory ahead of time. And those principles translate directly to cybersecurity. Any moment of crisis, you want to learn about how to deal with crisis before crisis. So it's just muscle memory when you're in it.
Amazing, amazing. In fact, this reminds me, one of the motivations behind me doing the kind of work I do in security was an article that I read, which was published in 2015 in Harvard Business Review, where they used the US nuclear navy as the example to describe the high performance security culture that was established by Admiral Hyman Rickover. And it is stated in that case that the 30 years of his leadership, the nuclear navy didn't experience any major catastrophic setbacks. But those statistics apart, what really got me thinking and got my attention when I was reading the article, of the different success factors, one was communication. And I'll share with you a particular anecdote that really got my attention, where the authors write that in the nuclear navy setting, when you receive an order from your commander or from your senior, you have to repeat the order verbatim before you execute it. And when I read that, I'm like, wow, I can't imagine this happening in the private sector, but that is such a cool way of ensuring there is no communication gap. Now let me connect to what you just said, which is also news to me. I didn't know that they trained with live ammunition. So, my God, that is truly a way of testing every possible memory, because it's the survival of the fittest. So there are numerous lessons that one can pull for or draw from the armed services sector. So I come back to you again, the similar question. You have learned a lot during your time with JSOC. What are some, for lack of a better word, skills or mindsets that are transferable to the private sector?
So we talk about train like you fight, which is probably the most consequential and most universal. The second part that's super important are the leadership lessons that I learned. So what makes special operations a high-performing or the best high-performing organization in the world, I think, are three attributes that I learned. The first one was they trust and empower those closest to the problem to make decisions and do the job, because they're the ones with the most context. And so there's this very low center of decision-making authority or gravity in the organization because they empower those closest to it. The second thing that's unique is shared understanding. There has to be no daylight between key members of the organization and what's happening in a particular problem set or environment. Because if somebody knows something and they don't properly disseminate it, it could cause risk to mission. And so there's this bias for understanding and bias for sharing information. And there's no real concept of a data cartel or an information cartel. Now, that is orthogonal to my experience at GE and elsewhere, where the data you own and the knowledge you have is key to your promotion. It's key to your survival to the next layoff. You want to make yourself indispensable by possessing and keeping all of that expertise to yourself. Well, if you do that in the special operations world, that's a huge risk. And so there's this shared understanding that's a fundamental tenet. And then the third is cadence. It's the heartbeat of the organization where you're driving accountability by forcing people to come together and make sure they've got that shared understanding. And that cadence is how you set the clock speed for execution. If the task force is only meeting once a month, well, that's the heartbeat. And you've got a lot of risk for drift between. At the same time, if the heartbeat is twice a day, you've now created a huge coordination tax. And so you've got to understand the right cadence that balances drift and tax in order to make sure that you're executing with a shared understanding and a bias for action. So those are probably the three organizational leadership or functional skills that I got to learn from and then apply at Horizon 3.
Very cool. Very cool. So during our planning process, when your team submitted a proposal to me, You all talked about a high stakes incident that shaped your thinking. Do you remember that one? The one that was discussed in the proposal?
There's been a lot. What I'll say is it kind of goes back to the same 3 lessons learned,
Right.
Which is no matter what the incident, we built the muscle memory, we had a shared understanding, lower decision-making authority, and then cadence to deliver.
Okay, that's fine. So, Snehal, this has been terrific. We are kind of closing in on to the final segment. We have a few more minutes left. And I know that we could go on. We could probably have a sequel, and I would like to have one at some point. But are there any messages that you wish to get across to leaders of medium to large organizations?
It goes back to the opening discussion that I had, right? So offensive AI lowers the skills required to run a cyber attack. They allow you to execute a cyber attack far faster than ever before. In fact, our AI hacker executes attacks at least 50x faster than a human in measured benchmarks. And then the third is scale. You have infinite cyber bullets. You no longer have to be selective of the target. Now, we're the good guys, thankfully, but the bad guys are gaining access to good enough capabilities, and they don't operate with the same guardrails. And so what we have to do is build that muscle memory for a response. You've got to learn how to respond to a breach. You've got to learn to reduce your blast radius. And you've got to do so with urgency and conviction, because the attackers are only getting faster.
Well, thank you very much. Final question. What advice would you give to students who are either considering a career in cybersecurity or who are pursuing education in the cybersecurity space?
Yeah, I received an appointment to be an associate professor at Purdue. So I'm doing that now, working closely with Petros and the CS department, which is just Don Jang. They're just an amazing group of people to work with. And it's a question that I remember hanging out late with Petros and others talking about in the Purdue University ecosystem. And what I think is happening is gone are the days of generalists. I think it's very difficult to pivot into a cybersecurity career from a completely other field and think you're going to be highly effective unless you are committed to and have the obsession of mastering your craft and becoming an absolute expert in an area. Because what AI is doing, I view AI as having unlimited interns. And the danger of AI is danger in the sense that if you don't know what you're doing, the answer looks good. But if you're only an expert is going to figure out that the answer is actually wrong. And it takes a significant now amount of expertise to realize that the answer is actually incorrect. And so I think that the skill of a person using an AI system, especially in cybersecurity, is going to increase dramatically. So if you are not obsessed with becoming an expert in cybersecurity, my opinion, you should probably pursue a field where you are obsessed with becoming an expert. Because I don't think entry level, if you're trapped at entry level or trapped at early career, you don't demand or have that obsession to become world class. I think you're going to have a really hard time competing in a world where everyone else is obsessed with becoming world class.
So just to probe a little deeper into what you share. So one is to be obsessed about being the best that you can be in the field. Now, as you know, cybersecurity has the technical side, and then they have the business side, the project management side, the communication side. So there are different skills that people come with, right? Like, let's say that there could be somebody who's amazing at testing, detection, but they may not be very good at communicating with the non-tech people. Because at the end of the day, it's not good enough to have a strong security team. Every organizational member needs to do their part to help the organization become more secure, more resilient. So ability to communicate effectively I think is very important. So going back to you, is there room for soft skills, or are we just focusing on hard skills?
There's absolutely room for soft skills. I actually see those two worlds converge. So the best leader I ever got to work for and see in action was a JSOC commander I worked for. And his superpower was asking the right question. So he could ask a single pointed, precise question and transform an entire organization as they pursued the answer of it. Not because he was super skilled at asking questions, but he was the most prepared person in the room. And so at the end of the day, what does it mean to be a master of your craft? It's you are obsessed with being prepared. What is the side effect of being prepared? You can ask the right questions and you can explain it in the right ways to those that have to make a decision. So I think that preparedness it cuts across your technical knowledge and domain expertise, your ability to synthesize, and your ability to communicate. And so I think that's the superpower is going to be the nexus of the three of those things.
Well, on that note, we will conclude this fascinating discussion with the hope that we can have another session at another point in time. Snehal, thank you so much for your time. It's truly been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate it.
The information contained in this podcast is for general guidance only. The discussants assume no responsibility or liability for any errors or omissions in the content of this podcast. The information contained in this podcast is provided on an as-is basis with no guarantee of completeness, accuracy, usefulness, or timeliness. The opinions and recommendations expressed in this podcast are those of the discussants and not of any organization.